So, I don't know how you sow your tomatoes, but today I'm going to show you several techniques, including some that allow you to produce huge quantities of tomato plants in very small spaces. Well, basically. I wanted to tell you in the title of the video or on the thumbnail the number of plants you can produce per square meter with this method. But the number is so unbelievable that I thought you would accuse me of clickbait again, so I preferred not to do it, and honestly, personally, I haven't even calculated that number, but if you feel like doing it, watch the video and let me know in the comments what number you came up with. So, in this video, I'm going to talk to you about sowing techniques and especially about the sowing techniques I use for tomatoes. But just know that you can use this method for any plant, whether it's a vegetable or something else. Alright, let's get started. As for the different techniques I use for certain plants, I do sowing in pots, seed by seed. So I fill a tray or a box with pots filled with seed compost or regular potting soil. Depending on what I'm going to do with them afterwards, usually it's a mix of seed compost and regular potting soil. And in each pot, we'll put 1, 2 or 3 seeds, knowing that these 2 or 3 seeds will then stay in the pot. I won't separate them. If I want to keep just one plant, I'll select the nicest one. So I sow directly into the pot that will later go straight into the ground, and that's it, nothing complicated. That being said, for tomatoes this isn't the most advantageous method at all, since this method has a few drawbacks. To start with, it takes up a lot of space. If I had to sow 100 tomatoes and use 100 pots, it would take up too much space. I don't have a heating mat that big, so I can't do that. Another drawback is that every seed that doesn't germinate was still sown in a pot, so it uses a pot and potting soil for a seed that doesn't sprout. It's a waste of pots and potting soil. I can reuse the pot, but not always the soil. So it's not the most interesting technique for tomatoes. That being said, I do use this technique for corn, sunflowers, and things that germinate quickly in a pot. I'm going to sow 5 corn seeds or 5 sunflower seeds. Then, after planting, as the plants grow, I'll select the nicest ones and cut the others. It's a method that can work. So for some plants, you can then sow either in small soil blocks or, like I often do, in cell trays. So regarding the space it takes up, obviously it depends on the size of the soil blocks or the size of the cells, but you end up with the same problem as with pots. All the seeds that don't germinate still take up space in a cell and use up the amount of potting soil in the cell. So every time a seed doesn't germinate, that's potting soil that's wasted. And then there's a bit of space that's used for nothing, so there you go. It's a bit like with pots, but still better, since the cells generally take up less space than pots. And these trays last much longer than most pots. In fact, it's a method I use for most of the plants I have here. But not for tomatoes, yes, because for tomatoes I sow so many that I need to be able to produce even more in even less space. So you can also sow seeds directly in trays like this one. There are different sizes, and here I have a slightly smaller one. You might plant a row of seeds for each tomato variety, placing several seeds in each row. So it saves space, you don't use pots, and the seeds that don't sprout just get lost among the ones that do. So there's no waste of soil or pots, which is pretty good. On the other hand, I personally can't imagine doing different varieties side by side, because then you might mix up the plants and not know which variety is which anymore. Unless you sow another variety of plants between each row of tomatoes, as long as those plants sprout at about the same speed as the tomatoes, so that transplanting goes smoothly. In short, it's interesting but too complicated for tomatoes, so I don't use this method either. I use this method for other plants for which I broadcast sow, seeds that are sometimes poorly sorted. I just sow everything in there in bulk, and then later I collect my plants. So I do this for Paulownia, for pheasantry. I do it for quite a few plants and fruits, but not for tomatoes. For tomatoes, still, you could imagine sowing in smaller trays and doing one variety per tray. And you can do this in really small trays. And the smallest tray I know is the pot. So in the end, we're back to sowing in pots. Sowing in pots is good, but then why not several per pot? When the plants reach this stage, we'll remove the root ball from the pot, separate them from each other, put them in individual pots, a bit like we would do with tray sowing, except here, well, it's a very small tray. So I'm going to ask you a little question here, and I invite you to pause to think about the question and answer it honestly. In your opinion, how many tomato plants can we put in a single pot like this? 10, 20, 30, 50 or more? There you go. Pause and tell me, for you, how many plants could we put in a pot like this without risk? So, how many plants can we put in a pot? You should know that today I'm less of a plant grower than I used to be. But there was a time when I really put in the maximum, and I would sometimes put up to 150 or even 200 tomato plants per pot like this. And by the way, that's pretty much what it can look like. I didn't count them, but I think there are at least a good 100 in each of these two pots, maybe even 150. So a pot like this is about an 8 cm square. So if you want to have fun calculating how many you could fit in a square meter and how many plants that would make, give me the answer in the comments. So, sowing 150 or even up to 200 tomato plants in such a small pot is possible. It's not even risky, but it just requires a few tricks to avoid any risks. And above all, it brings a lot of advantages. The first advantage obviously is that you'll save a lot of space, especially if you're using a heating mat that's not very big like mine and you have a lot of plants to grow. Another advantage, as we've seen, is that you'll save a lot of pots and soil. On the other hand, sowing this densely does come with certain risks, but if you know them, you can prepare for them. The biggest risk, for example, is damping off, which often happens when you sow too densely. Damping off. It's a fungus that attacks the tiny, very fragile seedling stem and causes it to rot, and when that happens, in a pot like this, it can kill all the plants in 24 to 48 hours. That's something that can happen, we know it, and to prevent it, there's a very simple solution. If you know a bit about fungi, you know they can't tolerate copper or sulfur, so there are sulfur-based treatments that kill all fungi. I'm not talking about buying a treatment, I'm talking about making a treatment from something that contains sulfur, like garlic for example. Boil a liter of water, crush 2 cloves of garlic and put them in the boiling water, strain it, let it cool, put it in a spray bottle, and spray this garlic water on your seedlings before germination. Don't wait for them to sprout. Don't wait until you have problems to act. Do it as a preventive measure. It costs nothing. It's not bad for the seedlings. You can actually do this on all plants that might be susceptible to damping off. So eggplants, peppers, many solanaceous plants, and even other plants as well. Personally, nowadays, out of habit, I spray it on all my plants. If you want a more detailed video on how to prepare this garlic-based solution against damping off, I'll put a link over here to a video I made exclusively on this topic. And thanks to this, we can easily sow large quantities of plants in small containers without having any disease problems afterward, and sow very densely. And getting a lot of plants offers other advantages as well. For example, it will allow you to select your plants if you want 3 tomato plants for your garden. If you sow 3 and out of the 3, one doesn't look good, you'll still be tempted to give it a chance. On the other hand, if you sow 10 and you still want 3, well, you'll pick the 3 nicest ones. And then the others, you can get rid of them or give them to friends. And the other advantage is that if you're a nursery owner, it allows you to produce large quantities of plants and always have extras to sell. If you're a gardener, it lets you have plenty of plants to trade. So it doesn't stop you from sharing, giving or selling nice quality plants and getting rid of the ones that aren't as nice. Positive selection is always more interesting. Well, on the other hand, sowing large quantities also has some drawbacks. Like, for example, if you want to sow a lot, you'll need a lot of seeds. For that, the most obvious solution, the nice one I would say, is to produce your own seeds. For that, you need to be able to produce seeds, but it's not that complicated. Especially with tomatoes, eggplants, peppers and chilies, it's very simple to produce these seeds. If you want to know how to do it, once again, I'll put a video over here where I explain all of that to you. You can also buy your seeds. There are seed suppliers like Biogerm, for example, who offer reduced prices for larger seed packets intended for market gardeners. That being said, even in the small packets sold to individuals, there are usually more seeds than you actually need, which still allows you to sow quite a lot. However, don't sow everything you have in the packet all at once. Do several waves of sowing spread out between the beginning, middle and end of spring, so you can have harvests that are spread out throughout the year. However, I still recommend sowing the whole packet within the year, or if necessary, keeping it for the following year, but don't keep seed packets for more than a year or two. After some time, seeds may stop germinating and are wasted, which is unfortunate. Producing your own seeds lets you grow new ones each year for future planting. This lets you adapt the plants to your garden and environment. Another drawback is that the more you put in the pot, the more quickly they'll become crowded, and the sooner you'll have to transplant them into individual pots. If you want to learn about transplanting, I made a video on it. I'll add a link over there. The video is a bit old, but that being said, it's totally suitable for this sowing method. Alright, so after transplanting, you'll need space to store plant pots. With 100 plants in one pot, it only takes up the space of one pot, but once they're transplanted, you'll need space to store 100 pots like this. So, make sure you have enough space to store your pots and also to be able to protect them. That's also why I recommend not sowing some slow-growing plants too early. will sow them in January, like peppers, eggplants, and chili peppers in January or February. On the other hand, tomatoes grow very fast, so there's no need to sow them before March or even April. There you go, it's better to sow a plant a bit late so it doesn't get cold, rather than storing plants, storing plants, storing plants, storing. I hope you enjoyed it. If that's the case, let me know, give a little like, share the video with your friends, and if you enjoy what I do, subscribe to my channel. That's always nice. Thanks to everyone who supports me financially. If you'd like to join the community making these videos possible, there's a link to Taipei over there. Thanks to everyone who will do it and those who already do. Happy planting and see you soon for the next part. Bye.